The morning sun cast long shadows across the private shooting range outside London. Marcus Thompson adjusted his stance, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle in his hands. To everyone around him, he was just another weekend warrior, a quiet man in his 50s who worked in government security and enjoyed target practice on Saturdays. The other shooters didn't know that Marcus had spent 15 years with the Special Air Service, or that his last assignment had been training the Royal Protection Unit in advanced combat techniques. They saw him as the friendly guy who always brought extra coffee and never bragged about his scores, even though he consistently outshot everyone on the range. "Marcus, you're making the rest of us look bad again," called out James, a local businessman who fancied himself quite the marksman. The group of regular shooters had gathered around the targets, comparing their morning's work. Marcus's target showed a tight cluster of holes in the bullseye, while the others had scattered shots across the paper. "Just lucky today," Marcus replied with his usual modest smile, carefully cleaning his rifle. He'd learned long ago that blending in was often more valuable than standing out. The other men laughed and began their usual routine of friendly trash talk and exaggerated stories about their shooting adventures. What none of them realized was that Marcus had been watching them for weeks, not as a fellow hobbyist, but as someone trained to assess potential threats. His presence at this particular range wasn't entirely coincidental. Intelligence reports had suggested that someone might be using civilian shooting clubs to scout for recruitment or to practice for something more sinister. The range owner, Gerald, was a former Army sergeant who ran a tight ship. He knew Marcus's real background and had quietly agreed to let him observe the regular customers. Gerald had noticed some unusual activity lately. New faces asking strange questions, people taking photos when they thought no one was looking, and conversations that stopped abruptly when others approached. As the morning progressed, Marcus noticed two men who'd been coming to the range for the past month. They kept to themselves, spoke in hushed tones, and seemed more interested in watching other shooters than improving their own skills. Today they were paying particular attention to him, whispering and occasionally glancing in his direction. The jokes and laughter continued around the firing line, but Marcus's trained eye caught subtle details others missed. One of the suspicious men had a small scar on his left hand that looked like a specific type of knife wound. The other man moved with the careful precision of someone with military training, despite claiming to be a shop clerk. "Hey, Marcus," shouted Tom, a construction worker who'd become something of a range regular. "Tell us about that time you said you worked with those Special Forces guys. Come on, give us a real story." The group gathered around, expecting another of Marcus's deflected answers. He usually changed the subject or made a joke about watching too many action movies. But today something felt different. The two suspicious men had moved closer, clearly listening to every word. Marcus realized he was in a delicate position. His cover story needed to remain intact, but he also needed to gauge the reaction of the potential threats. He decided to take a calculated risk. "Well," he said, setting down his rifle and pretending to consider the request, "I suppose I could tell you about the time we had to teach some palace guards how to shoot properly. Nothing classified, just basic training stuff." The construction worker laughed. "Palace guards? Like those guys in the funny hats who stand still all day?" "Something like that," Marcus replied, watching the two suspicious men from the corner of his eye. Their body language had changed instantly. They were now hanging on every word, their casual cover blown by their obvious interest. The range erupted in laughter and jokes about teaching soldiers to fight. But Marcus noticed that the two men weren't laughing. Instead, they were exchanging quick glances, and one of them had subtly positioned himself closer to the exit. Marcus continued his story, keeping it light and seemingly fictional, but embedded with enough authentic details that anyone with real military knowledge would recognize the truth. He watched as the suspicious men's faces grew more serious with each accurate detail he provided. "So there I was," Marcus continued, trying to explain to these guards that standing perfectly still might look impressive for tourists, but it's not exactly practical when someone's shooting at you. The group burst into laughter again, but Marcus noticed one of the suspicious men slowly reaching for something in his jacket. Gerald, the range owner, had been watching from behind the counter. His military instincts were still sharp, and he'd noticed the tension building among the group. He casually moved closer to his emergency phone, ready to call for backup if the situation escalated. The morning had started like any other Saturday at the range, filled with friendly competition and harmless boasting. But Marcus knew from experience that situations could change in seconds. His years with the SAS had taught him to always be prepared for the unexpected, even in the most ordinary circumstances. As he continued his carefully crafted story, Marcus made a mental note of every exit, every potential weapon, and every person's position in the room. The jokes were still flying around the group of shooters, but underneath the laughter, a much more serious game was beginning to unfold. The suspicious man's hand froze halfway to his jacket when Gerald's voice boomed across the range. "Time for the monthly safety briefing, everyone. Marcus, since you've got experience with training, mind helping me demonstrate proper weapon handling?" Marcus recognized the intervention for what it was. Gerald had noticed the tension and was creating an opportunity to diffuse the situation. The group groaned good-naturedly about having to sit through another safety lecture, but they gathered around the demonstration table as requested. "Right then," Gerald announced. "Let's start with basic rifle safety. Marcus here can show us the proper way to clear a weapon." As Marcus stepped forward, he positioned himself where he could keep both suspicious men in his peripheral vision. The demonstration gave Marcus time to think. The two men were clearly more than casual shooters, but their exact intentions remained unclear. Were they gathering intelligence on him specifically, or were they scouting the range for another purpose entirely? Their reaction to his palace guard story suggested they had some knowledge of British security operations. "Now, the important thing about weapon safety," Marcus continued, making his voice carry across the range, "is that you never assume a gun is empty even when you think it is. That's how accidents happen, and accidents can be deadly." The construction worker Tom nodded seriously. "Makes sense. I heard about a guy who thought his hunting rifle was empty and nearly shot his own foot off." The group chuckled, but Marcus noticed that the two suspicious men weren't paying attention to the safety demonstration at all. Instead, they were quietly photographing the range layout with their phones. "Excuse me," called out one of the suspicious men, speaking for the first time that morning. His accent was subtle but definitely not local. "This training you mentioned with the palace guards, was this recent training?" The question hung in the air for a moment. The regular shooters looked puzzled by the sudden serious tone, but Marcus recognized a probing question when he heard one. Someone was fishing for information about current royal security arrangements. "Oh, that was years ago," Marcus replied casually, continuing to disassemble the demonstration rifle. "Different times back then. I'm sure they do things completely differently now. Technology changes everything, doesn't it?" Gerald caught Marcus's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. He'd heard the question too and recognized the danger. As a former army sergeant, Gerald had enough clearance to know that asking specific questions about royal protection was a red flag that needed immediate attention. "Speaking of technology," Gerald interjected loudly, "we've got new security cameras being installed next week. Full coverage of the entire range, including the parking area, should help us keep track of everyone's progress." It was a subtle warning that the range was about to become much less private. The second suspicious man shifted uncomfortably and whispered something to his companion. Marcus caught only a few words, but they were enough to confirm his suspicions. The men were speaking Arabic, and one of them had just mentioned something about changing plans. Tom, oblivious to the undercurrents, was examining the rifle Marcus had been demonstrating with. "This is beautiful craftsmanship. Bet you could hit a target from incredible distances with something like this. How far did you say those special forces guys could shoot accurately?" The question was innocent enough, but Marcus realized that every piece of information was potentially valuable to the wrong people. He needed to end this conversation without arousing suspicion from the regular group, while also gathering more intelligence about the two strangers. "Distance shooting is more about patience than equipment," Marcus replied diplomatically. "Most situations require close-range accuracy anyway. It's nothing like what you see in the movies." He was deliberately downplaying capabilities while watching the suspicious men's reactions. One of them was no longer trying to hide his interest. He stepped closer and asked directly, "What kind of close-range situations? Urban environments?" The question was far too specific for a casual conversation, and several of the regular shooters began to look uncomfortable. James, the businessman, frowned. "That's a bit of an odd question, isn't it? We're just here for target practice." The atmosphere in the range had shifted noticeably. and even the most oblivious members of the group were starting to sense that something wasn't right. Marcus realized the situation was reaching a tipping point. The suspicious men were becoming bolder in their questioning, which suggested either desperation or confidence that they could handle any complications. Neither option was good news for the safety of the people around him. Gerald had moved to a position where he could quickly reach the emergency alarm, but Marcus knew that bringing in outside help might escalate the situation dangerously. The range was relatively isolated, and there were innocent civilians present who could be hurt if things went wrong. "You know what?" Marcus said, beginning to pack up his equipment. "I think I've had enough shooting for today. These old bones aren't what they used to be." He was creating an opportunity to leave while giving the suspicious men a chance to follow him away from the other shooters. "Leaving so soon?" asked the first suspicious man. "We were hoping to hear more about your training experiences. Perhaps we could continue the conversation over coffee." The invitation confirmed Marcus's worst fears. They weren't just gathering general information, they were specifically targeting him. The question was whether they knew exactly who he was or if they simply suspected he had valuable knowledge about British security operations. Tom looked confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. "Everything okay, Marcus?" "You look a bit pale." The concern in his voice was genuine, and Marcus realized that his years of training were showing despite his efforts to appear casual. "Just tired," Marcus replied, but his mind was racing through options. He could try to lose the suspicious men in the parking area, but that might put other innocent people at risk. He could confront them directly, but without knowing if they were armed or how many associates they might have. That could be dangerous. The jokes and laughter that had filled the range all morning had completely disappeared, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that everyone could feel but only a few truly understood. Marcus made his decision quickly. Instead of leaving, he set his rifle case back down and turned to face the group with a broad smile. "Actually, you know what? I just remembered a story that might interest you fellows." He looked directly at the two suspicious men. "It's about the time we had to deal with some people who were asking too many questions about things they shouldn't know about." The regular shooters perked up, expecting another entertaining tale, but the two strangers went very still. Marcus had just sent them a clear message. He knew exactly what they were doing, and he wasn't going to run. Gerald recognized the shift in tactics and casually moved to lock the main entrance. To the casual observer, it looked like he was just securing the range for the safety briefing, but Marcus knew his old army training was kicking in. They were now in a controlled environment. "This was during a routine training exercise," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. "We noticed some people hanging around the training area, taking pictures, asking questions about security procedures. Seemed harmless enough at first, just curious locals, we thought." The construction worker Tom was completely absorbed in the story. "What happened to them? Did you chase them off?" His innocent enthusiasm provided perfect cover for what was really happening. "Well, Tom, that's where it gets interesting," Marcus replied. "See, when you've been in this business long enough, you develop a sense for when someone's curiosity crosses the line into something more dangerous. These particular individuals made some very specific mistakes that gave away their real intentions." One of the suspicious men started to back toward the side exit, but Gerald was already there, apparently checking the lock mechanism. "Safety regulations," Gerald announced cheerfully. "Can't have multiple exits unlocked during active demonstrations. Insurance requirements, you understand." The second suspicious man's hand moved toward his jacket again, and this time Marcus was ready. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward and grabbed the man's wrist, applying just enough pressure to make his intention clear without causing visible harm. "Careful there," Marcus said conversationally. "Sudden movements around firearms can be dangerous. Gerald runs a very safety-conscious operation here." To the other shooters, it looked like Marcus was simply preventing an accident, but the man's eyes showed he understood the real message. James, still oblivious to the deeper implications, laughed nervously. "You're making me paranoid, Marcus. Now I'm seeing suspicious behavior everywhere. These guys are probably just photography enthusiasts or something." "Photography enthusiasts," Marcus repeated thoughtfully, still maintaining his grip on the first man's wrist. "That's an interesting theory, James. Of course, the question is what exactly they're photographing and why." "Gerald, you mentioned new security cameras. Have you noticed anyone taking unusual pictures around the facility?" Gerald nodded grimly. Funny you should ask. Been quite a bit of that lately. People photographing exits, sightlines, security arrangements. Almost like someone was planning something that required detailed knowledge of the layout. The first suspicious man tried to pull his hand free, but Marcus's grip was unyielding. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the man said, his accent now more pronounced under stress. "We're just hobbyists interested in shooting sports. Nothing more complicated than that." "Of course," Marcus replied pleasantly. "Just hobbyists. Though I have to say your questions about urban combat situations and royal protection details seem quite advanced for casual hobbyists. Most weekend shooters are more interested in hunting techniques or target accuracy." Tom was starting to look confused and worried. "Royal protection? I thought we were just talking about general military training. Are you saying these guys are asking about protecting the royal family?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. The two suspicious men exchanged a quick look, and Marcus could see them calculating their options. They were outnumbered, in an unfamiliar location with limited exits, but they might still have weapons or associates nearby. "I think," said the second suspicious man carefully, "that we should perhaps continue this conversation elsewhere. We seem to have created some confusion among your friends." "Oh, I don't think there's any confusion," Marcus replied, finally releasing the first man's wrist but staying close enough to act if necessary. "I think everyone here understands exactly what's happening. The question is what we do about it." Gerald had moved to his phone and was casually dialing a number. "Just calling the main office to report our safety demonstration," he announced. But Marcus knew he was actually contacting security services. The code phrases Gerald was using would bring specialized response teams within minutes. The regular shooters were beginning to realize that their peaceful Saturday morning had turned into something much more serious. Tom stepped back from the group, his face pale. "Marcus, are you saying these men are dangerous? Should we be calling the police?" "The appropriate people are already being contacted," Marcus assured him, never taking his eyes off the two strangers. "The important thing now is that everyone stays calm and follows instructions carefully." The first suspicious man's composure was beginning to crack. "You have no authority to detain us. We've done nothing wrong except ask questions and take photographs. That's not illegal." "You're absolutely right," Marcus agreed. "Asking questions and taking photographs isn't illegal. However, conducting surveillance on critical infrastructure, gathering intelligence on security procedures, and making inquiries about royal protection arrangements, well, that falls into a rather different category, doesn't it?" The second man was now scanning the room more frantically, clearly looking for an escape route or calculating the odds of fighting their way out. Marcus recognized the signs of someone preparing for violence and shifted his stance accordingly. James finally grasped the seriousness of the situation. "Gerald, should we evacuate the other customers? Get them away from here?" His business instincts were kicking in, concerned about innocent bystanders getting caught in whatever was about to happen. "Everyone just stay exactly where you are," Gerald instructed firmly. "Help is on the way, and the safest thing for everyone is to remain calm and let the professionals handle this situation." The sound of approaching vehicles could be heard in the distance, growing rapidly louder. The two suspicious men heard it too, and their body language became increasingly desperate. The sound of car doors slamming shut echoed across the parking area, followed by the measured footsteps of multiple people approaching the range entrance. The two suspicious men were now visibly agitated, their casual disguises completely abandoned as they realized their situation was rapidly deteriorating. "Last chance to do this the easy way," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. "Cooperation now will go much better for you than resistance later." The first suspicious man made a sudden decision. He lunged toward the weapon display case, apparently hoping to arm himself, but Marcus was ready. Years of SAS training kicked in as he intercepted the man with a precise movement that sent him sprawling across the floor without causing serious injury. "Nobody move," Gerald shouted, though it was unclear whether he was addressing the customers or the intruders. The regular shooters pressed themselves against the walls, finally understanding that they were witnessing something far more serious than a disagreement about shooting techniques. Tom's voice cracked with tension. "Marcus, how did you know?" "How did you know they were dangerous?" His question revealed just how skilled Marcus had been at maintaining his cover identity among the weekend shooters. "Experience. Marcus replied simply, keeping his attention focused on the second suspicious man, who was still standing but clearly calculating his diminishing options. You learn to recognize when someone's interest goes beyond casual curiosity. The main entrance opened with a sharp bang as the first response team entered. 3 men in civilian clothes but with unmistakable bearing of special operations personnel swept into the range with professional efficiency. The lead officer took in the scene instantly. Marcus standing over one subdued suspect, Gerald controlling the exits, and a group of frightened but unharmed civilians pressed against the walls. Situation? The lead officer asked Marcus curtly, recognizing him despite his civilian appearance. 2 suspects. Surveillance operation targeting Royal Protection Intelligence. Marcus reported in the clipped military style that came naturally after years of service. Subjects have been asking specific questions about palace security procedures and urban combat techniques. One attempted to access weapons when confronted. The second suspicious man finally spoke, his voice desperate. This is all a misunderstanding. We're journalists working on a story about military training. We have every right to ask questions and gather information for our article. Journalists, the lead officer repeated flatly. I see, and which publication would that be? Do you have press credentials, editorial assignments, any documentation of this alleged journalistic work? The man's silence was answer enough. Real journalists would have identified themselves immediately and produced credentials to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. The flimsy cover story collapsed under the weight of professional scrutiny. James, still pressed against the wall with the other regular shooters, whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. I can't believe this was happening right here, right next to us. We were just joking around about shooting, and these men were planning something terrible. That's how these operations work, Marcus explained, his voice gentler now that the immediate danger had passed. They blend in with normal activities, gather information slowly, and hope no one notices the pattern. Most of the time it works because people aren't trained to recognize the signs. Gerald was now helping the response team search the suspicious men's belongings. They found multiple phones with photographs of the range layout, detailed notes about security procedures, and contact information that would require further investigation. Most damning was a list of questions specifically about royal protection protocols and the timing of security shifts. Professional operation? The lead officer commented grimly. This wasn't some amateur attempt. Someone invested significant time and resources in gathering this intelligence. He looked at Marcus with obvious respect. Good catch. How long had you been monitoring them? About a month, Marcus replied. They started coming here regularly, always asking questions that were just slightly too specific, too focused on security matters. Gerald and I had been keeping an eye on them, but today they became much more aggressive in their information gathering. Tom was staring at Marcus with a mixture of awe and confusion. You've been watching them for a month? We thought you were just a regular guy who worked in government security. You never said anything about being some kind of undercover agent. I'm not undercover, Marcus clarified with a slight smile. I really am just a regular guy who works in government security. But sometimes regular guys with unusual experience notice things that other people might miss. It's not dramatic spy work. It's just paying attention to details. The first suspicious man was now conscious and sitting up, blood trickling from a split lip where he'd hit the floor. The response team officer knelt beside him and began asking questions in a professional but intimidating tone. Let's start with your real name and why you're so interested in British royal protection procedures. I want a lawyer, the man replied immediately, which told everyone in the room that he knew exactly how serious his situation had become. Innocent tourists or journalists don't immediately demand legal representation when questioned about their activities. Gerald was shaking his head in amazement. 15 years I've been running this range and nothing like this has ever happened. We get the occasional argument about scores or someone being careless with weapon safety, but actual spies gathering intelligence? This is like something out of a movie. It's really not that dramatic, Marcus insisted, though his modesty wasn't entirely convincing given the circumstances. Most intelligence gathering is boring, routine work. These men just made the mistake of being too obvious about what they were doing. The second suspicious man was being handcuffed now, his journalist cover story having been thoroughly debunked by the complete lack of any supporting evidence. As the reality of their capture set in, both men were becoming more cooperative, apparently hoping that assistance might improve their eventual treatment. The scary part? James said, still processing what had happened, is that if Marcus hadn't been here, they might have succeeded. They could have gathered all the information they wanted, and we would have just thought they were friendly guys who liked target shooting. The lead officer nodded grimly. That's exactly how most intelligence operations succeed. They rely on people being trusting and not asking too many questions about unusual behavior. In this case, they picked the wrong location and ran into someone with the training to recognize what they were doing. As the suspects were being led away, Marcus began collecting his equipment with the same calm efficiency he'd shown all morning. The transformation from weekend hobbyist back to security professional was subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. 3 hours later, the shooting range had returned to an uneasy quiet. The response team had departed with their prisoners, leaving behind only a few pieces of evidence tape and the memory of a morning that had gone from routine target practice to counterintelligence operation in a matter of minutes. Marcus sat in Gerald's office, filling out the final pages of his incident report. Through the window, he could see the remaining regular shooters in the parking lot, talking in animated clusters about what they'd witnessed. Tom was gesturing wildly as he recounted the story to someone on his phone, while James appeared to be explaining the situation to his wife with considerable difficulty. They're going to be talking about this for years, Gerald observed, bringing Marcus a cup of tea. I just hope they understand the importance of keeping certain details private. The last thing we need is this story spreading with embellishments that compromise ongoing security operations. Marcus nodded, understanding the concern. The lead officer briefed them about operational security before they left. They seemed to grasp the seriousness of keeping quiet about specific procedures and capabilities. Though I suspect the basic story will be too good not to share eventually. Can't blame them, really, Gerald said with a slight chuckle. It's not every day that regular people find themselves in the middle of a spy operation. They handled it well, considering. No panic, no one got hurt, and they followed instructions when things got serious. The phone on Gerald's desk rang, interrupting their conversation. After a brief exchange, Gerald hung up and turned to Marcus with a serious expression. That was my contact at headquarters. They want to know if you're available for a more detailed debrief this afternoon. Apparently, this morning's arrests have opened up some larger questions about ongoing surveillance operations. Marcus wasn't surprised. Intelligence operations rarely existed in isolation, and the 2 men they'd captured were likely part of a larger network gathering information about British security arrangements. The questions they'd been asking suggested knowledge of specific protocols that indicated inside information or extensive prior reconnaissance. Any word on who they really were? Marcus asked, finishing his report and signing the bottom of the last page. Still working on that, Gerald replied. Their documents were professional quality fakes, which suggests significant resources behind the operation. The phones contained encrypted communications that will take time to decode, but the initial assessment is that this was a serious, well-funded intelligence gathering effort. Through the office window, Marcus watched as Tom finally finished his phone conversation and approached the building. The construction worker had been deeply shaken by the morning's events, and Marcus suspected he had questions that the official briefing hadn't fully answered. Marcus? Tom's voice came through the door as he knocked hesitantly. Could I have a word with you before you leave? I know you've probably got official business to attend to, but I'm still trying to understand what really happened here. Of course, Marcus replied, opening the door and gesturing for Tom to come in. Gerald discreetly excused himself, understanding that some conversations needed to happen privately. Tom sat down heavily in the chair across from Marcus, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. I keep thinking about all the times we joked around with those men. They seemed so normal, so friendly. How was I supposed to know they were dangerous? What if they'd decided I was a threat because I asked too many questions? You couldn't have known, Marcus assured him. That's the point of their cover identities. They spent weeks establishing themselves as regular customers, building relationships, earning trust. You responded to them exactly as any reasonable person would, with basic courtesy and friendliness. But you knew, Tom pressed. You saw through their act. What did I miss? What signs should I have been watching for? Marcus considered his answer carefully. He didn't want to make Tom paranoid about every new person he met, but there were legitimate lessons to be learned from the morning's events. It wasn't any single thing, Marcus explained. It was a pattern of small inconsistencies over time. They asked questions that were slightly too specific, showed interest in topics that seemed unrelated to casual shooting, and their reactions to certain subjects didn't match their stated backgrounds. But honestly, without my particular training and experience, those signs would be nearly impossible to recognize. Tom nodded slowly, beginning to understand. So it's not that I was being careless or stupid. It's that I don't have the same background, knowledge to recognize when questions cross the line from curiosity into intelligence gathering. Exactly, Marcus confirmed. Most people live their entire lives without encountering this kind of situation. Your natural instinct to be friendly and helpful is actually a good thing. We just need people to be aware that these operations exist and to report unusual patterns of behavior to appropriate authorities. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle in the parking lot. Marcus recognized the unmarked car immediately. His debrief appointment had apparently been moved up. Through the window, he could see his former SAS colleague, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen, approaching the building. "I'm afraid I need to cut this short," Marcus told Tom apologetically. "But please remember that what happened here today was the result of good security procedures working properly. You and the others helped create an environment where suspicious behavior could be identified and addressed before anyone got hurt." Tom stood up, looking somewhat reassured. "I suppose you're right. And I have to admit, there's part of me that feels proud to have been involved in stopping something bad from happening, even if I didn't understand what was going on at the time." As Tom left the office, Sarah Chen entered with her characteristic no-nonsense efficiency. She'd worked with Marcus on several joint operations over the years and knew his capabilities well enough to trust his assessment of the morning's events. "Afternoon, Marcus," she said, settling into the chair Tom had just vacated. "Quite a morning you've had. The preliminary interrogations are already yielding interesting information about the scope of this operation. It appears we've stumbled onto something much larger than a simple reconnaissance mission." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "How much larger?" "Large enough that there are now 5 different agencies involved in the investigation," Sarah replied grimly. "What you intercepted this morning appears to have been part of a coordinated intelligence gathering effort targeting multiple aspects of royal protection protocols. The information these men were collecting could have been used to plan a serious security breach." The implications hit Marcus immediately. If the operation had been allowed to continue undetected, the intelligence gathered could have compromised not just the physical security of royal family members, but also the safety of protection officers and other security personnel. "Any indication of timeline?" Marcus asked. "Were they gathering information for immediate use or building a long-term intelligence picture?" "Still analyzing that," Sarah admitted. "But given the level of detail they were seeking and the professional quality of their operation, this suggests planning for a significant action rather than casual intelligence gathering. Your intervention this morning may have prevented something much more serious than we initially realized." 2 weeks after the incident at the shooting range, Marcus found himself sitting in a secure briefing room deep within Thames House, listening to updates on an investigation that had grown far beyond what anyone had initially imagined. The walls around him displayed maps, photographs, and timeline charts that painted a picture of an intelligence operation spanning multiple countries and involving dozens of operatives. Detective Inspector Sarah Chen stood at the front of the room, addressing a group of senior officials from various security agencies. The casual atmosphere of their conversation at the shooting range had been replaced by the formal protocols of a major counterintelligence briefing. The 2 subjects apprehended at the shooting range have provided substantial intelligence about a broader network, Sarah reported to the assembled group. What initially appeared to be a localized reconnaissance operation was actually part of a coordinated effort to map British security procedures across multiple high-value targets. The investigation had revealed connections to surveillance operations at other locations throughout London and the surrounding areas. The men captured at the range had been just one cell in a larger network that had been gathering information about royal residences, government buildings, and transportation routes used by senior officials. The timing suggests they were working toward a specific deadline, continued a representative from MI5. Communications recovered from encrypted devices indicate planning for an operation scheduled within the next 6 months. The intelligence they were gathering would have been used to identify vulnerabilities in existing security arrangements. Marcus studied the displays around the room, recognizing some of the locations and security procedures being discussed. His years with the SAS and subsequent work with Royal protection units gave him insight into how the gathered intelligence could have been used to plan an attack or infiltration operation. What's particularly concerning, added another official, is the sophistication of their methods. They weren't using amateur tactics or obvious surveillance techniques. This was a professional operation with significant resources and careful planning behind it. The briefing continued, with details about international connections and possible state sponsorship of the intelligence gathering effort. Several foreign intelligence services were suspected of involvement, though definitive attribution would require months of additional investigation. Gerald, the shooting range owner, had also been called to provide testimony about the suspicious activities he'd observed over the past several months. His military background and attention to detail had provided valuable corroborating evidence about the subject's behavior patterns and the gradual escalation of their information gathering efforts. The civilian witnesses have been remarkably helpful, noted the MI5 representative. Their detailed recollections of conversations and behavioral observations have filled in important gaps in our understanding of the subject's methods and objectives. Marcus thought about Tom, James, and the other regular shooters who had unwittingly been part of the surveillance operation. They'd handled the aftermath well, understanding the importance of discretion and cooperating fully with the investigation while maintaining their normal routines. Has there been any indication of other cells operating in similar fashion? Marcus asked during a break in the formal presentation. That's one of our primary concerns, Sarah replied. If this approach was successful enough to continue for months without detection, there's a strong possibility that similar operations are ongoing at other locations. We're reviewing security footage and visitor logs at shooting ranges, military museums, and other facilities where people with security backgrounds might gather socially. The implications were sobering. The shooting range had been targeted not just as a source of information about weapons and tactics, but as a place where off-duty security personnel might inadvertently reveal details about their work. The casual atmosphere and friendly conversations that made such places enjoyable also made them potential intelligence goldmines for skilled operatives. We've identified at least 3 other locations where similar patterns of behavior have been reported, continued another official. Golf clubs frequented by retired military officers, a pub near a military base where off-duty personnel gather, and a gym used by current and former police officers. In each case, new members have been asking unusually specific questions about security procedures and operational details. Marcus felt a chill as he realized how systematic and widespread the operation had been. The network wasn't just gathering random information, they were specifically targeting social environments where security personnel relaxed their guard and might share information they would never discuss in professional settings. What's the current threat assessment? Asked a representative from the Royal Protection Unit who had been sitting quietly through most of the briefing. Elevated but contained, Sarah responded. The arrests at the shooting range appear to have disrupted their timeline significantly. Intercepted communications suggest confusion and concern within the network about the compromise of their operation. They're likely reassessing their approach and may have postponed whatever they were planning. The briefing continued with discussions of enhanced security measures and revised protocols for identifying suspicious surveillance activities. Marcus listened as his morning at the shooting range was analyzed and broken down into procedural improvements that would help prevent similar operations in the future. The key lesson, one official noted, is the importance of maintaining awareness even in casual social settings. The subjects in this case specifically chose environments where people would naturally lower their guard and engage in friendly conversation about their work and experiences. Gerald had been instrumental in developing new guidelines for shooting range operators about recognizing and reporting suspicious behavior patterns. His experience as both a military veteran and business owner gave him unique insight into balancing security concerns with maintaining a welcoming environment for legitimate customers. We can't turn every social gathering into a paranoid security briefing, Gerald had argued during his testimony. But we can train people to recognize when casual interest crosses the line into intelligence gathering. The difference is subtle, but it's learnable. The investigation had also revealed how carefully the operatives had researched their targets before beginning their surveillance activities. They knew Marcus's background before they ever set foot in the shooting range, which explained their focused interest in his stories and experiences. What they hadn't anticipated was his ability to recognize their true purpose and respond appropriately. In retrospect, Marcus reflected, they made two critical errors. First, they became too aggressive in their questioning when they sensed an opportunity to gather valuable intelligence. Second, they underestimated the level of awareness and training that might be present. Among their targets, the final portion of the briefing focused on ongoing operations to identify and disrupt other cells within the network. Several arrests had been made at other locations, but the investigation suggested that significant portions of the operation remained active and posed continuing threats. This is likely to be a long-term counterintelligence effort, Sarah concluded. The network appears to have been years in development, with extensive resources and sophisticated operational security. Dismantling it completely will require sustained attention and international cooperation. As the formal briefing concluded, Marcus found himself reflecting on how a routine Saturday morning at the shooting range had evolved into a major security operation. The jokes and casual conversation that had characterized the morning seemed almost surreal when contrasted with the serious implications of what had actually been happening. The regular shooters had returned to their normal weekend routines, though with a new awareness of the potential for ordinary activities to intersect with extraordinary circumstances. Tom had mentioned that he found himself paying more attention to new people at various social gatherings, not out of paranoia, but with a better understanding of how information security worked in practice. 6 months later, Marcus returned to the shooting range for the first time since the incident. The familiar Saturday morning routine felt both comforting and strange as he unpacked his equipment at the same firing position where everything had started. Gerald greeted him with a warm handshake and a knowing smile, but the casual atmosphere from before had been replaced by a subtle but unmistakable increase in security awareness. The regular group of shooters had grown slightly smaller, with some members apparently deciding that their weekend hobby had become more complicated than they preferred. Tom and James were still there, though their conversations were more subdued, and they paid noticeably more attention to new faces among the customers. "Strange to be back here," Tom commented as he set up his equipment beside Marcus. "I keep expecting something dramatic to happen, even though I know the chances of lightning striking twice are pretty slim." "Actually," Marcus replied with a slight smile, "the chances might be higher than you think." Gerald's range has been designated as a training location for security awareness programs. We're teaching people how to recognize the kind of surveillance operation we disrupted here. Indeed, the shooting range had become something of a case study in how civilian locations could be used for intelligence gathering, and how ordinary citizens could play a role in identifying suspicious activities. Gerald had embraced this new role, seeing it as a way to contribute to national security while maintaining his business. "We've had groups from various agencies come through here," Gerald explained to the assembled shooters. "Police officers, military personnel, even some civilian security contractors. They want to understand how the operation worked and what signs we should have noticed earlier." The training programs had revealed just how sophisticated the intelligence gathering network had been. The two men arrested at the range were part of a much larger operation that had successfully infiltrated numerous social gatherings and recreational activities throughout the United Kingdom. Their methods had been refined through years of practice and had proven remarkably effective at extracting sensitive information from unsuspecting targets. "The scary thing," James noted, "is thinking about how much information they might have gathered before we caught them. All those conversations about work, stories about training exercises, casual mentions of security procedures. They were collecting it all and putting together a comprehensive picture of how our systems work." Marcus nodded, understanding the concern. The investigation had shown that the network had been building detailed profiles of British security arrangements for at least 3 years. They knew about shift patterns, communication protocols, personnel assignments, and physical security measures at dozens of sensitive locations. But the good news, Marcus pointed out, is that we did catch them, and the information they gathered is now outdated. Security procedures have been updated, personnel rotations have been changed, and everyone is much more aware of how these operations work. The arrests at the shooting range had triggered a comprehensive review of security protocols across multiple agencies. New training programs had been implemented to help security personnel recognize when casual conversations might be intelligence-gathering attempts. Social media monitoring had been enhanced to identify individuals who might be using online platforms to gather information about security arrangements. Tom was examining a new rifle he'd purchased since the incident. I have to admit, there's something satisfying about knowing that our little shooting club helped stop a major security threat. Makes me feel like we actually contributed to something important. You did contribute, Marcus assured him. Your cooperation during the incident and afterwards provided valuable intelligence that helped identify other cells in the network. The information you provided about previous conversations and interactions helped piece together the full scope of their operation. Gerald had received official recognition for his role in the operation, though the specific details remained classified. His military training and attention to detail had been crucial in identifying the suspicious behavior patterns and providing a secure environment for the arrests to take place safely. The ironic thing, Gerald reflected, is that they chose this location because they thought it would give them access to useful intelligence sources. What they didn't realize was that the same environment that attracted their targets also included people with the training to recognize what they were doing. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several new customers, and Marcus found himself automatically assessing their behavior and demeanor. It had become second nature to watch for the signs they'd learned to recognize: excessive interest in other shooters, questions that seemed too specific, photography that focused on security arrangements rather than targets or equipment. These particular newcomers appeared to be exactly what they claimed: a group of office workers trying shooting sports for the first time as a team-building exercise. Their nervous laughter and obvious inexperience with firearms marked them as genuine novices rather than trained operatives attempting surveillance. Looks like the real thing this time, Tom observed quietly, having also assessed the new arrivals with his newly developed awareness skills. Most of the time it will be, Marcus replied. The key is maintaining that awareness without becoming paranoid. We want to be alert to genuine threats while still being able to enjoy normal social activities. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere at the range gradually returned to something approaching the casual friendliness that had characterized Marcus's previous visits. The jokes and friendly competition resumed, though with an underlying current of awareness that hadn't existed before. The incident had changed everyone involved in subtle but significant ways. The regular shooters had gained an appreciation for the complexity of modern security challenges and their own potential role in maintaining public safety. Gerald had found a new purpose in training others to recognize similar threats. Marcus had been reminded that his skills and experience remained valuable, even in his supposedly quiet civilian role. Most importantly, the network that had been gathering intelligence for potential attacks against British targets had been significantly disrupted. While some elements remained active, their operational security had been compromised and their timeline disrupted. The information they had gathered was now outdated, and the security community was better prepared to recognize and counter similar operations in the future. As Marcus packed up his equipment at the end of the morning, he reflected on how a routine Saturday at the shooting range had evolved into a significant counterintelligence success. The jokes had indeed flown that morning 6 months ago, but underneath the laughter, a much more serious game had been playing out, one that demonstrated the importance of vigilance and the value of ordinary citizens who understood their role in maintaining collective security. The morning sun cast the same long shadows across the range as it had 6 months earlier, but now everyone present understood that even the most routine activities could have extraordinary implications for national security.